Today we're going to be looking at the Twenties Woman. This is Unit 4, Notes number 3. We're going to be looking at how the role of women changes during the 1920s, what new opportunities open up for them, and how that affects their personal lives. Women earned the right to vote. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified and granted all women the right to vote. The women's suffrage movement had been fighting since the late 1800s for the right to vote. The ratification of the amendment was helped by women's contributions at home during World War I. It instantly doubled the voting base in the 1920 election. Not all women rushed out to vote or thought that they should vote. Many women felt that it wasn't their place to participate in politics and that should be left to men. So even though this amendment was passed and women could vote, it didn't necessarily change everyone's opinions and attitudes on the topic right away. Initially, most women voted the same as their husbands or their fathers. They really didn't have their own political ideas, strong ideas, and it would be a while before women would become a powerful voting bloc that politicians campaigned directly for. So now, the middle-aged housewife female vote is very, very important to politicians. They pay very close attention to how women are voting in terms in trying to have stances that will appeal to them to make sure that they come out and vote. But in 1920, that wasn't the case. So here are a few pictures of women, the women's suffrage movement. So the women's suffrage movement had been going on since the 1800s with women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth campaigning, creating parades, and just making a stance that women should be able to vote. So it wasn't just something that came about. It had been a campaign, a movement that was long and fought for. So let's stop and think. How does women gaining the right to vote change elections? So it definitely adds new perspective to elections in terms of who the candidates are now trying to win over. So they're having to appeal to not just men, but also women. Sometimes women have different perspectives in terms of the family, the household, with the children. So it's definitely adds new perspective. Young women changed the rules. By the 1920s, the experiences of World War I, the pool of cities, and the changing attitudes had opened up a new world for many young Americans. In the rebellious, pleasure-loving atmosphere of the 20s, many women began to assert their independence, reject values of the 19th century, and demand the same freedom as men. During this time, a new ideal emerged for some women, the flapper. She was an emancipated young woman who embraced the new fashions and urban attitudes of the day. Many young women became more assertive. Some began smoking cigarettes, drinking in public, dating frequently, things that would have ruined reputations just a few years before. So, the things that the flapper did and was known for, by our standards today, do not seem so controversial and wouldn't put people up in arms. But it was such a stark change at the time and a drastic change at that that shocked many people. So the flapper. Flappers were known for their close-fitting felt hats, bright waistless dress an inch above the knee, skin-toned silk stockings, sleek pumps, and a string of beads. So this whole look that embodied a flapper, like the one pictured here. Young women also cut their hair into boyish bobs and dyed it jet black. So very, very short haircuts. This replaced the dark and prim ankle-length dresses, whalebone corsets, and petticoats of the Victorian days. So this gives you kind of more of a contrast to kind of what this Victorian image of a woman was versus this new flapper. And you have to understand that this change happens within, 15, 20 years. It's not like this is how women looked in the 1850s. No, women were dressing like this in the early 1900s, the 1910s. Then the 1920s comes around and women are rejecting almost all of these kind of fashion trends. They're not wearing corsets. They're cutting their long hair, making it short, having more of this boyish figure, And even just the amount of skin that they're showing. Again, by today's standard, not so crazy. But they used to wear dresses that went all the way down to their ankles, long sleeves, necklines all the way up to their neck, basically showing no skin whatsoever. Now they have dresses that go up to their knees, they're showing their arms. So it is completely scandalous and something very radical for the time period. The flapper reality. Magazines, newspapers, and advertisements promoted the image of the flapper. Although many young women donned the new outfits and turned away from tradition, the flapper was more of an image of rebellious youth than widespread reality. It did not reflect the attitudes and values of all young women. You would probably more see flappers in the big cities and urban areas, that these younger women that were more likely to want to adapt these new styles. Where in rural America, small towns, farm, didn't necessarily adapt these changes right away and kind of rejected them initially. Traditionalists in churches and schools protested the new casual dances and women's acceptance of smoking and drinking. Many women were pulled back and forth between old standards and new. So let's stop and think. Why was the flapper considered to be so controversial? So this change that she embodied was so different. She also kind of stood for an independent woman that many people were not necessarily willing to accept at the moment. How far the style of dress had gone, how revealing it was, her behavior being so blatant. And it really was a symbolism for the rejection of traditional values. So for many people, that was controversial. New work opportunities. Many female college graduates turned to women's professions and became teachers, nurses, and librarians. Big business required extensive correspondence and record keeping, creating a huge demand for clerical workers such as typists, filing clerks, secretaries, stenographers, and office machine operators. Women often earned less than men and faced discrimination in the business world. The changing family. Widespread social and economic changes reshaped the family. The birth rate declined in the 1920s. Social and technological innovations simplified household labor and family life. Stores provided ready made clothes, sliced bread, and canned goods. These innovations had the effect of freeing homemakers from some of their traditional family responsibilities. The changing role of women. Women began to experience greater equality in marriage. Women also started to experience the pressure of juggling work and family. So if they worked outside of the household, but still had to take care of their home, their family. Education and entertainment reflected the conflict between traditional attitudes and modern ways of thinking. So let's quickly look at this chart, this pie charts showing women's changing employment from 1910, 1920, 1930. A lot of them stay the same. You want to notice the clerical changes from 1910, 7.3 goes up to 16.6 and 18.5. So that's all reflective of these women going into the workplace more, having these office jobs available to them. And also, another big note is agriculture. So it goes from 22.4 to 12.7 to 8.5. That is showing more of the shift from women leaving farm life, moving to the cities. They don't want to stay doing agricultural work. We see this huge shift during the 20s to go to urban centers because that's where the jobs are. So let's stop and think. How do new work opportunities affect the role of women? So, by being able to have a job, women are able to be more independent. They don't have to depend on having a husband to support them, living at home with their parents to support them. They can move out, live by themselves, and kind of live that flapper lifestyle. It allows them to embody those things. It also gives them more control over their life, not having to get married right away. And so it just opens up new doors, more opportunities, and women not being so limited. And again, this is just the start. You still see a huge number of women still being homemakers and housewives. So again, not everything changes initially, but we are seeing that door begin to open at the 1920s. So this is the end of the notes. Make sure you go back and do your key terms.